We've talked about a lot of classic machines here on Vintage Geek. We've talked about the PET, we've talked about the Amiga, but today we're talking about one of the most iconic and best-selling personal computers of all time. It's the Commodore 64, right here on Vintage Geek. Just a quick reminder, if you like vintage technology and computers, be sure to like and subscribe. It's going to help us as we grow, and I would encourage you to consider becoming a Vintage Geek member. You can do that right at our website at vintagegeek.com. Back in 1982, Commodore unleashed upon the world one of the best-selling computers of all time, the Commodore 64. Now, this came after a series of computers earlier in the line. We've talked before on the channel about the Commodore PET, Commodore's first entry into the home computing line, and one of the original trinity of home computers, including the TRS-80 Model 1 and the Apple II. Later on, Commodore came out with a small form factor unit called the VIC-20, which was also popular and had some really integrated and unique features, but it was after the VIC-20 that things really took off for Commodore because they came out with a system called the Commodore 64 in January of 1982.
With a 64K built-in memory for under $600.
Now, this incorporated a lot of the features that the VIC-20 already had, and originally this project was called the VIC-40 as it was supposed to be the next computer in line in that series. But there were some really interesting things that Commodore was able to do with this model. One is that they were able to integrate a high-performance video chip which allowed multicolored sprites to be used on screen, and it also had a dedicated audio chip that had superior performance to really anything that was out at the time. Commodore was directly involved in the production of those chips, so they were able to keep the cost down, which is what made the Commodore 64 able to sell for a whopping price of $595, which was very affordable in those early days of computing, especially compared to other models that were available at the time. The Commodore 64 was extremely popular, almost right out of the gate, and sold anywhere between 12 and 17 million units. It actually set a Guinness World Record for the number of units sold over the course of its life, and they continued production of the Commodore 64, as I understand it, until 1994, which is a 12-year run for a personal computer, which also seems like it could be record-setting in its own right. Many, many years after the Commodore 64 was discontinued, the rate of people that were still familiar with the name and the brand was extremely high, and I think it shows because there's a whole community dedicated to the Commodore 64 and its software, which is extensive. There are over 10,000 software titles for the Commodore 64, and obviously we would never get to a small fraction of the amount of software available, but we are hoping to showcase some of its abilities with the software that we do have here in the museum. I also want to take a look today at the unit itself, some of its physical features, and we want to take a look at its capabilities in the world of basic programming by putting in a short example program before we get into some of the prepackaged software. I will note that a lot of people that reviewed the Commodore 64 when it came out were a little bit critical of its performance in the world of basic programming, kind of indicating that a lot of the software would have to be prepackaged to take full advantage of its capabilities in both graphics and sound. I have no context for that other than what I've read, so I'm really looking forward to getting to try this myself, as I really never got a chance to mess with a Commodore 64 when I was a kid. We had the Tandy Color computer, and I had access to Apple II and some of the IBM models, but I didn't really have any friends that had a Commodore 64, and I'm really anxious to see what this machine can do from all of the wonderful things I've heard about it over the years. So let's get into it. This is one of the few Commodore 64 units that we have here at Vintage Geek. This particular Commodore 64 is especially clean. We actually found this one in its original box, and it seems to be in great working order. And I really do love the color scheme on the Commodore 64. I always have every time I've seen it in a picture. The two-tone kind of brown and tan really seems to work well. It makes everything kind of pop. The keyboard has a different appearance to it with the brown keys, where a lot of keyboards at the time were the standard white or off-white. The unit itself is pretty basic, and it's lightweight. You can move this around pretty easily. The keyboard itself has a decent feel to it. There's no actual click to the keys, so it's not like an IBM Model M or anything, but there's good motion in all of the keys on the keyboard. We have a full set keyboard here. There is no number pad at the end of this, but there are 4 function keys, and you have F1, F3, F5, and F7 available on the far right-hand side of the keyboard. One thing that I noted that was a criticism brought by early reviewers was that the keyboard on the Commodore 64 only has 2 cursor keys. So the up and down cursor movement and the left-right cursor movement are on shared keys, which is a little bit weird. I could see where some people may not love that. But everything else is pretty standard about the keyboard on the Commodore 64. At the top of the unit, we have the distinctive Commodore 64 logo, which I think a lot of people would still recognize even if they hadn't seen a system for many years. This logo is very prevalent with its multiple color bands, and those bands are kind of represented with these stripes that go across the top that are actually concealing some cooling vents more towards the right-hand side side of the case. And then at the very right, you've got your power LED indicator to show that the machine is on. But other than that, it's really pretty basic. It's a simple design, it's clean, everything is pretty easy to find. I'm pretty impressed with it overall. So going across the back panel of the Commodore 64, we have a number of different connectors and expansion slots. We're going to get into that as we kind of dig into the book a little bit. Again, I never got to mess with the Commodore 64, so this is my first time looking at some of these things. We have a standard RF type TV output that you could use similar to the color computer and other computers at the time. You could use channel 3 or channel 4 to output to your standard television. There's also an 8-pin connector for video. Now, one thing that's interesting about the Commodore 64 is that they did provide a way, as I understand, to do a standard composite type video output, which we've seen in some of our other examples of early computers, but it also had an S-video type output, which would include Chroma and Luma as separate connectors. The Commodore monitors could actually take advantage of that at the time, and so they could provide an even clearer and crisp picture, which we're going to definitely try out in our test setup today. We also have a connector on the back here for the serial or the floppy drive. We do have a number of 1541 floppy drives in the collection. However, as I understand it, they were one of the most problematic pieces of the Commodore 64 setup originally. We do not have an original 1541 working currently, but we do have the later version, the 1541-2, which is working. So we're probably going to use that to load our floppy disk-based software. There's also a couple of edge connectors on the back of the unit. One of these is, of course, for the Commodore 64 cassette, which was the same cassette that they used even back to the Commodore PET days and for the VIC. I think that there were some differences in the format of those cassettes from an audio perspective, but the actual physical hardware was identical. Now, if we take a look at the side panel of the Commodore 64, you do have the power switch, which is just kind of a standard rocker switch for turning the system on and off. There are a couple of DB9 ports, and those were for the original control paddles, or you could use a joystick. We do have an example of both. We have the paddle type and we have the joystick, so we can try that out. And then, of course, you have the multi-pin power connector. The power supply for the Commodore 64 was outboard. It was not built into this case, which is why it is pretty light and easy to move around. The actual power supply brick for this is pretty hefty and plugs in easily. It was always a little bit of a compromise for these early computers, I feel, as to whether they put the power supply in the physical chassis or in an outboard unit like the Commodore does. In this case, I think it's probably beneficial. Keeps a little bit of the heat away from the electronics inside and probably adds to the longevity of the system. Plus, if you need a new power supply, you could just buy the new brick and you would never have to really take anything apart to be able to change it out. So next, I want to take a look at what the Commodore 64 can do with its built-in version of BASIC, which is what comes up when you first power it on. Let's see if we can write a program. Just a quick note before we get started, we are using the original Commodore CM141 monitor. It looks great with the Chroma and Luma connected to it. It's got a really nice picture. For our capture, we're actually using the television type output of the Commodore 64. Both video feeds actually look really crisp and clear right now, so I'm pleased with the results on that so far. I'm going to be using some sample programs from the Commodore 64 manual that actually came with this particular system. There are tons of books out there with programs for the Commodore. I'm not going to get into a lot of depth here. I just want to kind of cover the basics and some of the things the machine could do that some of the other machines we have tried weren't able to natively do. One thing that the Commodore 64 is known for being good at is its multicolor sprites. So I wanted to use a sample program in the book to just kind of illustrate how the sprites can work with the Commodore 64. I'm going to key in this short program and see what happens. The book says that what you were supposed to do here is create a sprite image on a piece of graph paper to start with, and then you would convert that into data values that you're going to put into the Commodore 64. After that, you would enable the sprite, and then you use a pointer to tell the C64 where to store that sprite data. After that, you're going to read the data in, you're going to poke that into a particular memory location, and then after that, you apply the color to it. These are all covered in the basic program that we're going to write right now. I'm just kind of talking about how they're explaining it in the book. So let's get started here. Now, right off the bat, we're going to be using one of these special character keys. Just like the PET and the VIC, the Commodore has special graphics characters on the side of each key. These can be enabled using, I believe, a shift function to be able to display them. We need to use this heart icon to start with. So let's see if we can, yeah, there it is. I do like the feel of the keyboard on the Commodore 64 so far. It seems very easy to type on, especially if you've done anything with the original Commodore PET and its cash register style keyboard, which is a total nightmare. You can check that out in one of our previous videos. Now we're to the data lines, and I believe the data lines are where we're basically taking the sprite that would have been created on graph paper and we're actually kind of setting up those memory locations. The return key spacing is a little bit off for me, so I keep hitting the equal sign instead of return, one thing I noticed about the keyboard. All right, so there's our basic program that the book gave us as an example. Let's see what happens when we run this. Oh, look at that, little smiley face. Let me run that again. Oh yeah, look at him go. That's pretty cool. So essentially the sprite that was created was the actual image of the smiley face, and the different loops are actually moving that sprite around on the screen. So you don't have to keep redrawing it over and over again. That's pretty neat. It says here if you change a couple of the lines, this line on 55, and that's bigger. Pretty cool. The only thing that doesn't seem to be working, and I think this is because I'm using the wrong character somehow, is the beginning line, the print and this heart symbol is supposed to clear the screen, but it's not happening. It's just printing the heart, so I must be using the wrong character there. I seem to remember having this problem on the pet as well. Aha! Use shifted clear home key to produce heart symbol shown in parentheses. Okay, they covered that earlier in the chapter, so let's see. So if we use the aha, that makes more sense. Now we should have a clear screen for our smiley face to run around on. Oh yeah, that's nice. That's a nice smiley face right there. Now it gives us one other thing to try here that should be interesting. This is supposed to enable other sprites, I guess? Didn't look any different. Oh, it's because I didn't add the full complement of lines. I only did one. Ah well, I like the smiley face enough. There's only a few lines here. I gotta see what this looks like. Yeah, let's see what this does. Ooh, different background color. Oh yeah. Now we're talking. We got smiley faces all over the place. We got different colors. They're moving around. It's a continuous loop. It's pretty cool, actually. And the fact is that really wasn't a lot of code that had to be written to do this, so I could see where this could be pretty efficient with the use of sprites to actually move things around in a game format. I like it. I have to say, so far, I am very impressed with the Commodore 64. I kind of expected that I would be, given all of the comments and things people have written about the system over the years and things that I've heard about it. But the sprite capability and the graphics are really cool so far. I like what it can do with a limited amount of code, and I'm sure that there are endless possibilities, which have been evidenced in the 10,000 software titles or so, that could be done with the Commodore. I did want to mention that I was interested in learning a little bit more about the audio functionality of the system, and I did try one of the sample programs in the book, but it didn't work as advertised. I checked through the program several times, and I'll have to look into that a little bit further. But I feel like this was a good introduction into the system for me, get to learn a little bit about how it works, how the basic programming language works, and I'm really looking forward to trying some prepackaged software for the system to see where everything kind of shines and all of the different engineering and software techniques that went into those programs. So be sure to stay tuned. That may be coming up on an upcoming video. In the meantime, I want to remind you that if you like vintage technology, vintage computers, be sure to like and subscribe. It's going to help us a lot as we grow, and I would urge you to consider becoming a Vintage Geek member. You can do that right on our website at vintagegeek.com. We've got all sorts of extra video content, extra code and features, and a whole lot more. Plus, you can get merchandise like the cool shirt that I'm wearing today. Be sure to check that out at vintagegeek.com. Until next time, I'm Aaron, and this has been Vintage Geek.